Mr. President, as everybody knows, tonight President Trump will give an address to a joint session of Congress. I look forward to attending the President's address, and I am happy to welcome my friend Abraham George, who will join me as a guest tonight. In addition, 3 other Texans will be joining the President tonight as his guests. Alexis Nguri from Houston, Texas, is an angel mom who lost her lovely 11-year-old daughter, Jocelyn. Jocelyn was tragically murdered by 2 illegal immigrants who, just weeks before they were apprehended and released by the Biden administration. Next, from Texas, Roberto Ortiz from Weslaco is one of our brave veterans who served nearly a decade in the U.S. Border Patrol. Roberto's courage in the face of danger has been tested repeatedly, as he's been shot on multiple occasions by cartel members while on the line of duty near the Rio Grande River in my home state. And finally, Elliston Berry from Aledo, Texas, is a 15-year-old victim of computer-generated deep fakes. I applaud Elliston for her courage in joining us here tonight, for using her voice to speak out against the dangers imposed by new technologies. President Trump has rightfully turned the page on a wide array of President Biden's disastrous policies, from reforming our runaway spending through DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to prioritizing investment in semiconductors and manufacturing, to bringing our hostages held in Gaza back home to their families. But perhaps one of his most significant accomplishments thus far, and it's only been about 6 weeks, has been when it comes to border security, something near and dear to my heart and the heart of my 31 million constituents who call Texas home. Border security played a significant role in the mandate that the President got last November. The past 4 years were marked by President Biden's failure to enforce the law and to secure our border. And this was without a doubt a crisis, a humanitarian and public safety crisis of the former administration's own making. This was truly a man-made crisis. Starting from the campaign trail, President Biden invited the massive wave of migration by promising a, quote, surge to the border for asylum seekers. Can you imagine a president inviting a surge to the U.S. border of asylum seekers? This is one promise that, unfortunately, he kept. But President Biden's failures went far beyond just his rhetoric. In the early days of his presidency, President Biden basically reversed every policy President Trump had put in place, including the Remain in Mexico policy, which has been remarkably effective. In other words, people seeking asylum need to remain in Mexico while their claim is being processed. And the truth is, only about 15% of people who claim asylum in America who appear in front of an immigration judge ultimately are granted asylum. They meet the legal criteria, whereas the other 85% do not. The Biden administration also halted construction of President Trump's border wall and instead used federal funds to store already paid for wall materials. So not only did the taxpayer pay for those materials, they had to pay for the storage of those materials when they weren't used for their intended purpose. As the border crisis continued to evolve for the worse, President Biden ended Title 42, the COVID-19 policy era policy that was our last line of defense to keep a lid on the migrant crisis when President Biden refused to enforce other laws. After undoing the successful executive orders made by the first President Trump administration, President Biden then decided to circumvent Congress and attempt to make illegal immigration legal, using temporary programs that were never intended for that purpose. His Department of Homeland Security created the CBP One app, the short for Customs and Border Protection, an app for your phone which allowed migrants to literally schedule a visit to a port of entry so they could then claim asylum and then enter the country. Another Biden-Harris administration program allowed up to 30,000 migrants a month to enter from 4 countries: Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So that was 360,000 migrants who were basically told, if you come, you can stay in the United States. But they were conferred a temporary status that left them all in legal limbo. And let's not forget the Biden White House cooking the books on illegal immigration by abusing the parole system. Now, parole is a word that people who are familiar with the criminal justice system understand, but this is different. In immigration terms, parole means you were essentially released into the United States even if you didn't claim a right to be able to stay, for example, a right to asylum. They're just simply released as a border control measure to avoid bad publicity at the border when people were sleeping in the streets and lines were stacking up. Of course, we know what the tragic consequences of these misguided policies look like: a crisis of mass illegal immigration, human trafficking, drug trafficking across our southern border. Approximately 100,000 Americans die each year as a result of drugs that come across the southern border. Approximately 70,000 from synthetic opioids like fentanyl, which is the leading cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45. During all 4 years of the Biden administration, the number of illegal migrant encounters with CBP totaled over 10 million. That's basically 10 million people showing up and saying, let me into your country, and the Biden administration said, come on in. But on top of that, there were about 1.7 million gotaways. Now, gotaways are people who were evading law enforcement, who appear on some sensor, a camera or some other sensor, and evade law enforcement. And of course, now we know they are freely roaming the interior of the United States. Now, let me ask you this. If you know that you could show up at the border and be allowed to enter, basically ushered into the country, why in the world would you evade Border Patrol? Well, I think the simple answer is these are people who knew that they would not be able to enter because of criminal records, because they were transporting drugs, or engaged in some other illegal activity. Yet they made their way into the interior of the United States. Fentanyl, which I mentioned a moment ago, was manufactured from Chinese precursor chemicals smuggled through the open border, which has taken tens of thousands of lives. And the people of Texas, the 31 million people that I'm honored to represent, have felt the burden of President Biden's disastrous border policies most acutely because we are closest to the problem. We are at ground zero. Governor Abbott, our outstanding governor in the Texas legislature, filled the gap when the federal government refused to do its job along the border. An international border is the responsibility of the federal government, not the state government. But what's the state supposed to do if the federal government says, we don't care about the law, we're not going to enforce it, it's up to you? Well, Governor Abbott and the Texas legislature stepped up, and they spent roughly $11.1 billion to fill the gap that should have been filled by the federal government. And for that reason, I am insisting that Congress fulfill Governor Abbott's request to be reimbursed the $11.1 billion that the state taxpayers had to spend that rightfully should have been the expense of the federal government and federal taxpayers all across the country. There could be no doubt that this historic crisis was the direct result of President Biden's policies, and that's one reason why I believe not only he did not run, but Vice President Harris lost the election. It was a rejection of those open border policies. I'm looking forward to hearing the president discuss tonight the incredible strides his administration has made in just about 6 weeks since his inauguration. Nowhere is that success more apparent than when it comes to border security. After 4 years of record highs, CBP is now facing record lows. The Border Patrol tells me now we can do our job. We're not relegated to changing diapers or transporting migrants from one facility to another. We can actually keep out the worst of the worst and enforce the laws when it comes to border security. As soon as President Trump was elected, even before he took office, the migrant flows began to subside. That's called deterrence. If you know the law is going to be enforced and you know you're not going to be successful in making your way into the country, why would you spend thousands of dollars in order to pay off a cartel member to smuggle you up to the border? During November and December of last year, after the election, encounters were at their lowest levels between the ports of entry, the lowest levels since August of 2020. In the first 2 weeks of January, Customs and Border Protection encounters were nearly 50% lower than they were at the same point in January 2021, 50% lower. During the latter half of the month when President Trump actually took office, apprehensions fell by a staggering 85% compared to the same period in 2024. You know, the statement's often made, elections have consequences. Well, one of the most important consequences of President Trump's election on November the 5th was we are now reestablishing border security. And the people of this great country are safer for it. During the entire month of January, there were less than 1,500 apprehensions a day, a nearly 40% decline from December of last year. And just 1 week ago, Customs and Border Protection hit a 15-year low of only 200 encounters in 1 day at the southern border. These numbers are pretty impressive, but they are not at all surprising. They are a direct result of the deterrent effect created by President Trump and Secretary Noem's policy changes. Migrants know that a Trump administration means our laws will be enforced. If you can make your way into our country using legal means, by all means, do so. As I mentioned earlier, our country is the most generous in the world when it comes to legal immigration. We naturalize about 1 million people a year. So if you have a desire to come to America, do it through legal means, not through illegal means. Instead of rolling out the welcome mat like President Biden, President Trump started his second administration by turning the traffic light red instead of green. On day one, President Trump declared a national emergency, which it was, at the southern border, giving him greater flexibility to implement his executive orders. He reinstated the Remain in Mexico policy and ended President Biden's disastrous catch and release policies. Secretary Noem, our new Secretary of Homeland Security, began her tenure in the President's cabinet by sending a clear video message to migrants that she intends to enforce the laws that prevent illegal immigration. But she didn't stop there. Under President Trump and his administration, ICE arrests, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE arrests have increased more than 600%, which include arrests of criminal migrants, which have doubled. They've returned to a common sense case-by-case approach to humanitarian parole, which had been abused under the Biden administration, where it was used as a way to have mass releases of migrants at the border who made no legitimate claim to be able to stay. They were just released. Secretary Noem has also clawed back the $80 million a month spent by FEMA to house illegal migrants in luxury hotels in New York City. That's where your tax dollars went, to put people who had no legal claim to stay in the United States in hotels in New York City to the tune of $80 million. The These policies are welcome. They're good news to my constituents in Texas, and I believe to people across the country. There's a reason why Secretary Mayorkas, the former Secretary of Homeland Security, who was responsible for implementing the border security measures of the Biden administration, there was a reason why he was impeached by the House of Representatives. He simply did not do the job he had sworn to do. Well, Texans have had to bear the brunt of open borders for 4 years, which includes rampant crime and deadly fentanyl. So I look forward to working with President Trump and Secretary Noem to continue the important work they have begun to keep Americans and Texans safe. Mr. President, I yield the floor.